Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our podcast today is brought to you by the University of Hong Kong's RegTech Lab, the HKU Standard Chartered Foundation's FinTech Academy, the Asia Global Institute, and the HKU edX Professional Certificate in FinTech, as well as support from the HKU faculty of law. Our topic today is investigative due diligence and why it matters. The term due diligence has often been so overused that currently, in the colloquial vernacular, it's used as a quick, easy, shorthand, often lazy way of describing a plethora of background checks that vary from the basic perfunctory desk research that one might do in an office to full-blown investigations. Our guest today is Daniel Greenberg. He's the founder, president, and lead investigator of Greenberg Corporate Intelligence in Washington, D.C., a boutique investigations firm that began operations in March of 2023. The firm offers research and intelligence services for private sector clients, such as support lawyers, private equity firms, hedge funds, compliance teams. Dan's been working in the due diligence and corporate investigations field since 2010. Most recently, he was managing director at Forward Risk, having previously worked at industry giants such as Kroll, Exeger, and TD International. Starting in 2018, Dan helped grow Forward Risk from a small, newly established company with a handful of employees to a premier firm with over 25 full-time investigators. Forward Risk, turns out, was acquired in November 2022, and after a transition period, Dan left to establish his own independent firm, GCI, with a track record of uncovering hard-to-find facts, overcoming difficult challenges, and providing responsive service. His experience has mainly centered on investigative due diligence, shareholder activism support, litigation support, and competitive intelligence. Credential-wise, Dan holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in International Affairs from the esteemed George Washington University and a Master's degree in Middle Eastern History from Tel Aviv University in Israel. Dan is also a certified fraud examiner and is licensed as a private detective in the District of Columbia. And with that, Daniel, thank you for joining us.
For that extremely kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here on this discussion.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from originally? Where'd you grow up, and how did you end up in the field of corporate investigations?
So I'm originally from Providence, Rhode Island. I'm a very proud Rhode Islander, always will be. It's definitely the smallest state in the United States. Delaware is close in size, but Rhode Island is smaller. But we packed a lot into a small little space. Yeah. I grew up not too far from Brown University, a wonderful school. But ended up coming to Washington, D.C., to George Washington University for undergraduate. So when I was growing up, I was very interested in anything related to international affairs, whether, it was travel, history, global history, anything of that nature. And so I really thought D.C. was the place to be. And I think I was right about that. I think it was a great education. So I initially, maybe I thought I was going to end up in the State Department. A lot of people do have this similar interest and they end up becoming foreign service officers. And I thought maybe I was on that track. Just over time, when you are young and you're learning about different things, your interest can shift in various directions and here and there. One of the things I wasn't ready for was the State Department requirement to basically move every 2 to 3 years, right? As a foreign service officer, the amount of uprooting yourself and going from country to country, that was maybe a little more than I had in mind for the international affairs side of things. So the question was, how do you end up in the investigations field from that background? A lot of people end up doing it because when I was sort of going through my studies and graduating and things like that, I was looking for alternatives to State Department work without going to law school. And I knew that I was good at a few things. I was good at research and I was good at writing, and I had international experience, some foreign language skills. Was able to basically put a report together on people from history. right? And it turns out that doing investigations is like doing that professionally, except instead of looking at people from history, you're looking at people who are alive today. So I always connect that to my interest in international affairs and some background in history. I think that those are two very good ways to prepare, not just for pre-law, but also for investigation.
Same tool set, same skill set applied to a different milieu. Yeah, I mean, if you can make it work for you, all the better. Because what's traditionally struck me about your line of work is that, okay, you expect the former law enforcement, the former military, the former intelligence types, but increasingly, I mean, if you talk to Steve Vickers, former head of Kroll, when he had his firm International Risk after he left Kroll, and even Kroll for the longest time in the contemporary world, a lot of their people are former journalists, and because a lot of the work involves the same stuff. It's about finding information. It's about working your sources, and gathering that detail. And but having people from those different backgrounds working towards the same goal, all dovetailing towards the same goal, with slightly different skill sets, but more or less working in the same direction, seems to work. I mean, they find there are genuine synergies to be had.
I think the disciplines you mentioned, law enforcement and journalism, are two of the most important for the industry still today. It's just that there's so much, the breadth of knowledge that you need does point in the direction of generalists, people who are just generally very capable, especially with a strong liberal arts background, right? There's so much information that you can obtain during the course of an investigation, and being able to have very good critical thinking skills and reading comprehension, and come across industries or legal issues or financial issues that you've never seen before, but be able to teach yourself those skills very quickly so that you can analyze them as part of your investigation. That's really a generalist skill set. And a lot of people that do study liberal arts majors, political science, international affairs, history, classics, philosophy even, they have that generalist ability, and they've been able to slot into a lot of due diligence roles very successfully, even without a law enforcement background. That's certainly not to disparage those who have that background. Bring a lot of, obviously those skills are extremely important in certain cases. But you'll see the staff up. I mean, the number of people working in due diligence today is probably huge compared to what it was in the 2000s.
For sure. I mean, I remember growing up here, and you had what? Hell, I mean, if we just look back to the 90s, Kroll pretty much had Hong Kong to themselves. I mean, there was fact finders, there was, they did low-level traditional gumshoe work. You had Hill and Associates. Their presence wasn't as big as it is now. You had, I think Control Risk was still around. I don't know if they were present in Hong Kong at the time. But if you look at that period from 91 to 99, Hong Kong was still a virgin territory. Kroll had it. And from what I gathered, I mean, because of the name, they would have a steady stream of business. But all too often, from speaking to alumni of that time, people wouldn't come back to them. And I think that is the beauty of what Jules Kroll, the founder of Kroll, former prosecutor, did. That, when he started the firm with his wife and their accountant in his kitchen, that he created his own business in what was predominantly considered low-level work. Lawyers didn't even want to acknowledge that they retained the services of private investigators back in the day. He made it a Wall Street function. He cleaned it up, made it a white-collar function. When you do that, where you can charge the Wall Street law firms and bankers a premium for that type of work. But he created his own industry, but he created his own competitors. Because if you look at the heads of a lot of the senior leadership of Kroll's competitors, they were former Kroll alumni. I mean, it's amazing that you work there, because I hear it's one of the best professional alumni networks to be a part of.
I guarantee that that's still very accurate. it is amazing how often I'm able to, meet people at different points in their career in this industry, or important contacts from my firm. And many of them either worked with me at Kroll or they were there at different offices or things like that. And we know a lot of the same people. So we're just one degree removed. So yeah, even in more recent times, obviously everything you said is very true about how Jules Kroll professionalized the industry and made it white collar. And that's still the case today in terms of Kroll being a huge brand name, and a lot of people, if their entry point into the industry is both, clients recognize the name, and then as employees, they very much are hiring. And so when I first started there, it was called Integrity Risk International. There were corporate mergers and things like that.
Cherkasky and Marsh and McLennan had the great reinsurance giant had sold it because it wasn't contributing that much to their bottom line, and it was weird that they even purchased it to begin with, but then they had internal investigations of their own. And I mean, I have enough information on Kroll. I was once asked to write a book about it, but that project did not move forward. But yeah, I mean, so you automatically, it does in a sense build rapport, right, with all the people that you met that were former Kroll.
In general, it's a collegial industry, and I think that having that in common just adds to that. I think investigators that I work with and those who I meet, we become fast friends because we worked at Kroll together at some point, or some firms like that. We quickly find common ground and commonalities, and I think maybe it's our personality that people who work in this field, we're usually pretty hard workers. We have a lot of stress that we deal with. And so I think we find a lot of comfort in connecting with people, whether or not we're coworkers or client vendor relationship or whatever it is. And so the networking aspect that you mentioned is very real. And I think it's been an important part of my career.
Yeah, I wonder how much of an explosion in this field is attributable to 9/11. I mean, if you think about ACAMS, the Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialist credential, I mean, the Cuban-American gentleman who started that, I mean, a lot of it was timing, and 9/11 happened, he just took off. And then you look at the explosion in this space, certainly since 9/11, I mean, control risk was around before then, but then in the years since, we started hearing about firms like FTI, Navigant, Protiviti. I mean, you were with Exeger as well. I mean, this is a very competitive space.
Well, yeah, totally.
And okay, people are catering to people at different price points, and the industry is wised up. I mean, at one time, Kroll, as you and I both know, oftentimes defining the problem is more than half the battle, right? So the thing, people would go to Kroll. This isn't a slag off Kroll, but just an example of a business practice that had to change, otherwise they were shooting themselves in the foot. People would go to Kroll. Kroll would, write up a summary and say, okay, these are your problems. This is our suggested plan of attack. People would take that briefing from Kroll and say, okay, fine. This is what Kroll's willing to do for you. Willing to do it cheaper. And people often would. So much so that people had to wise up and say, okay, fine. If I'm going to do a preliminary intake and devise a plan of attack for you, that initially is going to cost what, 10, 20,000 US dollars. I think FTI is now the most expensive, one of the most expensive in this space. I mean, again, that was an example of a business practice that had to change because, I mean, I don't know why, when it comes to information, when it comes to an intelligence-based product, when it comes to, that type of service, I don't know why people don't value it as much. I mean, and I guess you see people in the legal field. I mean, one of my professors often had a saying, when people would come to him at a cocktail party and ask him for a little bit of free legal advice, he was like, if I were a dentist, would you ask me to check your teeth? Do you find that when it's a service, people don't value it as much?
A small business owner, which I'm sure we'll talk about more, the commercial side of the field is, of course, top of mind. It has to be. And I think what you're talking about is an industry that's evolved so much that it's still not fully mature in some ways where, what is it? What is the value of intelligence work? Are numbers
Precisely.
being pulled out of thin air?
Yeah.
It's very hard to comparison shop. There's no Amazon for any kind of investigative due diligence. And if there is, it's not a huge part of the market that I'm aware. It's something where there's so much variation between what is actually being provided that the numbers, you're not just paying for hours, you're paying for the brand, you're paying for the reputation of who your investigator is, you're paying for their expertise, and you're paying for a lot that's sort of amorphous. And clients are right to ask what they're getting for the money. And your point about, doing work for free, it's a lot of time. One of the big questions is what are you doing as an investigator if it's open source due diligence that I can't do for free on Google? And that's a question I can talk for hours about. But these things are always going to be questions. What is the value of an investigator? Because we can never command the sort of hourly rate that an attorney at a very high level, right? The biggest attorneys in New York and DC and London, that's another tier when it comes to cost. But also a lot of private detectives who are former law enforcement might charge very low rates compared to lawyers. And a lot of due diligence ends up in the middle, in between some of the local private detective rates versus, and of course, not as high as the highest end lawyer. Where in the middle you fall depends on a lot of different, factors that I can talk about more. But I hope that's a bit of an answer at least.
Well, it leads me to say that oftentimes it's guys like you and the work product you produce, certainly in furtherance of litigation, that can either make or break a case. But you're right, you can't charge what a licensed attorney can charge. The other thing that strikes me is that, okay, open source desk research, other than a typical natural language search, most people don't know how to do terms and connectors search. We forget LexisNexis and Westlaw, but most people can't even use Google to the fullest. And so I think there's something to be said for, years ago, I wrote an article, and yes, the person I was interviewing was a former British Army intelligence officer and former Kroll alumni. And, the Kroll alum said, you do open source research first. Then, if you can't find what you're looking for, you go to an actual firm. But again, most people don't know how to, other than just doing just typing in exactly what they're looking for into Google, which may or may not get you what you're looking for. They don't know how to research because they've been just so spoiled with the efficient search engines of the modern age.
And I've led so many training sessions about how to use Google for investigative due diligence. And it's funny, is recently you heard the phrase prompt engineer sort of enter the lexicon, right? And This is people who know how to enter text into ChatGPT and get good results. Well, before that, entering good Google searches is also being a prompt engineer in a way. The open source intelligence community will focus a lot on what they call Google Dorks, DORKS, which just means using Google search operators. And there are some that are slightly more advanced, but they're all very easy to learn. The most basic mathematical concept is these Boolean operators, the use of the word and the word or in different ways. Usually you explain this with Venn diagrams. And that is like, well, I want to know if this person was accused of any of the following 15 things. And you could try to build a string like that. But Google presents its own challenges. It's almost resistant. It's resistant to advanced searching in some ways because it's not very literal. It wants to show you certain results based on its priorities rather than the investigators. And so there's sort of a delicate interplay between getting advanced with your Google search strings versus not trying to over-engineer to such an extent where you've gotten so fancy that someone who's just putting in a few easy terms actually gets better results. Whereas databases like LexisNexis and Westlaw that you mentioned are much more literal in the way that they accept search inputs. And therefore, the more advanced, the better to some degree. They're meant for advanced use. With Google, it's really meant as a consumer-facing, it's almost an advertising platform at this point. It's still an extremely important investigative tool. And using it, it's both a matter of understanding those Google dorks, which I could explain a few key ones.
Sure,
but
please.
more than that, it's about asking the right questions in general. It's about thinking about your objectives in a more sophisticated way, and then just entering terms that ask the question you need to answer.
It's interesting because so many people have pointed out that just as I've heard some professors at HKU Law School say that just as if it's an open book exam, you still need to have studied somewhat. You still need to know where in your notes, where in the book, you need to get certain bits of information to answer which particular question. So they would analogize and say that similarly with generative AI, you've got to know how to write the right prompts. You have to know enough about the subject matter to ask pointed questions. Otherwise, you get gobbledygook on the way out. And that's so in that sense, AI should not be seen as a panacea for the lazy. It is not the ultimate cheat code to get them out of doing serious studying, serious research, serious delving into the subject matter, whereas the thinking seems to be that humanity can just coast along on autopilot, and anytime I need to know something, I'll just ask AI and bring myself up to speed. You have to continually be doing that on your own, such that you can use AI effectively when you need it to ask pointed questions.
The importance of all technology, AI is the newest and it's very important, but, Google is also advanced technology that changes every year. And we have a million other technology tools that are essential. None of these have, made it easy to do our work. Let's just say, if it was, I would love that. I would love to have more time to play video games at home. If the tech was able to do it all for me, I would love that. But we're not anywhere close to that. And it is, I think, because of what you said, it is wonderful. It's a tool. It's going to help you, but knowing how to use it effectively and get what you want, it's a lot harder. Just because something's free and it's plain text rather than software code does not mean that all thinking goes away. I think quite the opposite. Asking the right questions. I mean, anyone who's worked in journalism knows asking the right questions is not something that just happens. It's something you do as a profession. I think the same goes for investigators.
Your point about it being plain text versus software code, I mean, is so true. I mean, think about it. If we think back to just basically Windows is not that much of an evolution from DOS. On a code level, it exists on a higher platform of DOS, but on a functionality visual level, it's very different, right? Because the graphical user interface. But you think about the days when we had to put in multiple diskettes and type in multiple codes to operationalize one piece of software. There was more thinking that went into that, as opposed to I'll just click on Windows and open up the functionalities that I need: word processing, spreadsheet, database, what have you, PowerPoint. I mean, it's because of the ease, people don't have to think about it as much.
Bring that up. I mean, I'm someone who definitely used DOS and Windows 3.1 growing up.
We both did. Yeah.
I come from a programming family, even though I'm not a programmer myself. So I always have the...
Oh, it's all right.
My dad and brother, computer software engineers. And I would say that for the investigator, you're using a lot of databases.
Yeah.
And these databases are graphical, but if you don't have a deeper understanding as to how databases function, it's very easy to make a mistake on a graphical interface. And you see mistakes all the time if you're not careful and you don't catch them with simple selecting all the different buttons and bubbles, all versus open cases only, search past the year or all time, and then which jurisdiction. These are all different options and different databases you might run. And some people struggle with that. And I'm not going to opine on this, but it's possible that people that didn't grow up with sort of the older tech, might have a little bit of difficulty interacting even with graphical interfaces that are not as user-friendly as the most modern software platform.
I think because we were familiar with the DOS days, that we've seen behind the curtain, so we know kind of what goes on there, versus once the GUI became standard, people were more focused on functionality. I don't need to care about what's behind the curtain. I don't need to care about what goes on backstage. I just focus on the functionality and how I can use it to achieve what I need to. And yes, I do think that something's been lost. But come back to your point about Google Dorks. I mean, you stress that your background is focused on using open sources, public records, and interviews to identify and understand fraudulent behavior and other risk issues. Could you elaborate? I mean, what does that mean in practical terms? Are there any examples, any war stories you can share from the clients you've served without, giving us too much indicia as to whom you're referring to?
So I actually have put together a few, I would say, case study or war story examples. I'll just have to be almost annoyingly vague sometimes because of how careful we are about confidentiality.
Understood.
Yeah, I would say in general, the open source and public records, and the only difference between those two is that traditionally public records as the phrase refers to government records, and open sources are other types of publicly available information, like you might find on a news website or social media. You'd be surprised what you can find just doing the desktop research. I'm a big advocate for this. We'll talk about the interplay with human intelligence as well. A very recent case that we did, then there was a man in his 30s in the United States, and he was charged with one very serious crime a while ago. And then there was a news story about a very similar but separate incident along the same lines. And what was interesting about this case is this person had hired a reputation management firm in South Asia, and he had been able to scrub a lot of his online profile. And many people, if you simply run the name through Google, would actually not find anything negative about this person, even though there were criminal charges and a news report. And so there were a few tricks as to how you could get that. They weren't Google Dorks necessarily. In some cases, and people often forget about this, something can be scrubbed from Google, but still available on Yahoo search or Bing, or some of the, those are a little bit less popular as search engines. But sometimes when people are doing reputation management, removing things from the internet, they miss a few things. And that was an instance where the criminal litigation should have been on the official government web portal that has federal crimes all listed, but it wasn't there anymore. Somehow it got removed. But as private investigators, we have other databases that we pay for that have archived information, and we were able to find that as well. And so this was an example, I would say, of reputation management. The Google search page, page one had been completely cleaned up intentionally. But with a little bit of digging, you can find things that are missing. And those news articles were available via LexisNexis, which of course is a major data provider, and something called the Wayback Machine. So the Wayback Machine is an open source tool. If you put a web URL into the website, you'll get versions of that website from the past. So what did IBM.com look like in 2001? What did it look like in 2010 or 2015? It'll have iterations saved on there that are completely free to access. And so if something has been removed from the internet, it's not on the first page of Google, it hasn't been removed from the whole internet, just that first page. Wayback Machine was a really good option there. And this was a case where I won't get into what the man did wrong or allegedly did wrong, because again, I'm a little touchy about giving case details away. But suffice it to say, it was beyond reputational concern, and to the point where it would, in my opinion, if any of it was true, be a complete deal breaker for any interaction whatsoever.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
Fair enough. Yeah, fair
that's one example. I've got a bunch.
I think the beauty of the Wayback Machine, I think it goes all the way back up to 2000, is that each night it takes a snapshot of the internet, and it's a tool I've used, and I found sites that I thought were gone, but I managed to locate them using that tool, and it's fantastic that it exists. It doesn't cover everything, but more often than not, you'd be amazed at how much they do capture each night.
Exactly, and it's a good example of one. There are many open source intelligence tools that do specialized functions. I would say Wayback Machine is obviously one of the more popular ones. But for whatever need you have, by now there's usually an open source tool out there. Some of them are free, and then some of them are expensive. And as a business owner, you have to weigh sometimes the benefit that you might get for your case against, are you still going to be making a profit if you buy every tool that you could possibly imagine? But I try to get as many as I can afford, because they, each one has an example where, wow, if I didn't find this, my whole case would look differently.
So since we're on, since the overarching theme of today's discussion is due diligence, what does it mean to you? Because it's a term of art. It meant something, or should mean something specific, like it once did. But it's entered the lexicon, it's entered the colloquial vernacular, and it's seen as shorthand language for background check. But again, sometimes people are pretty perfunctory in the way they do it. They're pretty slipshod. They're pretty glib. They're pretty flippant. And that's not to say everyone or every situation warrants a full-blown investigation. But like with a bank, and if you're vetting a new client, then sometimes it makes sense to just drive through a particular part of town, make sure, that they do have that place of business, they do have a premises out of which they operate, take a few snapshots of their signage, their awning, and drive past. In that sense, a bank can be said to have completed their due diligence requirement. But sometimes it clearly goes deeper.
And the phrase itself is almost, it's funny the way the English language changes. The phrase itself, the due part means, I guess, appropriate is a synonym. Yeah. And the diligence, you can see the impression of hard work. So if you're doing a screening, a very high level screening, it doesn't seem like diligence. On the other hand, you're right that every situation is completely different. If you have a population of 100,000 names that you need to be screening, you can't do a full-fledged investigation on all of them. And so what does due diligence mean to me? I think it means knowing who you're interfacing with and being or holding accountable when people have done things wrong, with the understanding that they might do that wrong thing again in the future. And that can be applied to so many different scenarios. But I personally believe that the accountability piece is a crucial part of that. If you have people that are going through this world regularly committing fraud or doing things they shouldn't be doing, and they keep getting away with it, it is because someone has not done their due diligence. And the way that, the phrase, it's going to mean everything from a $100 background check where you just look at some very high level things to, in some cases, a $50,000 investigation. But the phrase is really amorphous because in some cases, you're not even talking about a background check. So, for example, when you have a due diligence process at a bank, the background check is only one component of that due diligence. And some of that customer due diligence relates to things like getting their identification documents and reviewing them, which is not, in my opinion, a background check. And likewise, in a lot of due diligence is third parties of major corporations. That's often vendors or suppliers or anyone that has a long-term contractual relationship with a major corporation. And they fill out like due diligence questionnaires. And so they're actively involved in the due diligence process. And the investigative component is only one element of the overall due diligence. And so that's why, why are people confused about what the name means, due diligence? It's honestly, it's many things all at once, which is not unlike the word investigation, which can mean so many different things in different contexts.
Very true, very true. And if we take a step back from the just street level, then we get into due diligence amongst the world's largest banking and financial institutions and multinational corporations. And for them, it's a matter of should we onboard this client, or should we do this deal with them? Should we take them on as a third party vendor? Should we do this M&A transaction? I mean, when the stakes are that high, what does or should investigative due diligence mean to big players? I mean, clearly their burden is higher, but does the meaning and the nature of due diligence fundamentally change, or does it just mean there are more intermediate steps for them to meet their due diligence burden?
Due diligence that you conduct should be aligned with the risks and the importance of the overall deal, right? So if you're having a consumer banking for, someone who puts $10,000 into a checking account, there's not a lot of risk. There's, if there is something wrong with that, it's not a lot of money. So you're talking about big institutions, big deals. Are they devoting enough resources for you to actually call it due diligence? Or is it an insufficient amount of diligence being conducted? And I think that this is an ongoing discussion. And I think if you talk to many people that work in my industry, the common answer will be that there's an underspending on due diligence. There's constantly pressure on the budget, on compliance teams. We're talking compliance, there's a lot of uses of due diligence, but I think that there's probably a happy medium, but it's more than's currently being done, because the trend that I have observed is sort of pushing against increased spending on due diligence, increased leverage there, and finding ways to always be streamlined. And that does come at a cost. I mean, that's my opinion. I could go into more detail, but I think if you ask people that are practitioners here, we've seen instances where major deals were carried out with the barest of due diligence. And it's frustrating on the researcher when that more work should be done. And in some cases, that's going to be, I imagine, something a regulator is going to notice.
But is that not understandable in that oftentimes, again, the due diligence part is seen as a formality? It's like an additional expense we have to undertake for the deal to go through. But you do the due diligence, you find out things you'd rather not know, red flags pop up, and voila, you spent all this money, you've hired a professional firm, and they're telling you not to proceed, or what's in the report is tending towards that direction. And the view is, okay, fine, you spent all this money, and now we can't do the deal. And what do we have to show for it other than additional expense? I mean, sadly, that is all too often the thinking.
There might be some situations when that's true, and it's my own personal observation that it's usually in the other direction, that the sort of commercial interests that you mentioned, in most cases that I've seen, it actually does tend to take priority, because people do like to make money. You make money by making deals happen, not by sitting on the sidelines, right? I think one thing that the due diligence industry has been trying to do better, and hopefully has done better, is explaining that not every risk that they find is a red flag, right? A red flag connotes something like stop everything you're doing, drop the deal, and run away from it. But the term red flag, it might not be appropriate for more minor matters. And how do you distinguish between the day-to-day routine findings that every company is going to have versus this is the con man? or this is a clear fraud, something you absolutely should walk away from, and you'll wipe your forehead, the sweat off your forehead, and say, I am so glad I did not do this deal. And a good due diligence researcher will contextualize the findings for the for the deal team, for the compliance team, everyone that reads that report, and hopefully has a conversation about the findings. Because if you say that, there was securities litigation involving this company, if you're not that familiar with reading these reports, you might think that's a real issue. Securities litigation, where investors defrauded, that sounds like exactly the type of thing you want to avoid. This is just an example, but often securities litigation is routine whenever a merger is announced. If it is a publicly traded company, there's almost always a securities lawsuit filed. Maybe they say we want more information on the proxy statement, or there's some conflict of interest of the financial advisor. Every case is different, but in many instances, it's not even a yellow flag. It's course of business, the things that always happen. But you don't know that as a due diligence researcher if you don't have the business and legal savvy, and experience, I guess, is what brings you to that level, so that you put things in their proper context. You don't make a big deal out of nothing. And so that when you do have a big deal, it's actually meaningful. You're not just throwing up a bunch of red flags around every time that there's something, a dispute. Because if you're a big enough business, you're going to get involved in litigation. There's going to be someone unhappy with you at some point. And the job of a due diligence researcher is not to blow things out of proportion and kill deals. It's to provide true factual information with a sophisticated understanding of how important it is.
That's a valid point, because oftentimes lawyers were often accused of killing deals, so much so that I remember one firm that I did research for. Some lawyers were allowed in the room because they were seen as adding value to the deal, but the bean counters, the pencil pushers, the rigid types who were telling you, no, you can't do this, you can't do that, they were sent out of the room until they were ready to draft the contract. That they trusted them with. But, it underscores a different mindset. I mean, to me, it always seemed as though when it came to due diligence, you hadn't, let's take the banks, for example, that you hadn't completed your due diligence burden unless you looked at things on a case-by-case basis, and you looked at things in each case on its underlying merits and judged it accordingly, as opposed to, again, the lazy shorthand approach of, okay, let's just engage in wholesale de-risking and not deal with any category of client who is in this particular line of work, say shipping or jewelry, for example. And we'll save ourselves the hassle and the grief and not deal with anyone in those particular sectors. That's not proper due diligence, though. I mean, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts.
Almost the opposite, in my mind, of how I would personally approach a case. I mean, one of the major biases that, investigators are usually trained. Anyone who does an analytical research is trained to be aware of their own biases. And if you see a category and you automatically jump to a conclusion there, that's almost more than a bias. That's like a stereotype. You've got countries around the world that have higher risk profiles. You've got industries and family connections. But the purpose of an investigation, I do think that when we're talking investigative due diligence, I try to use the word investigation to sort of avoid burying the fact that is what we're doing, right? We're looking to identify facts that are hidden or that are unknown, or even if they are known, confirm them and outline them clearly. That's all going to be on a case-by-case basis. The world is a very, very complicated place. And if you say, if this, then that, if that is your style of thinking, I don't think that you're a good fit for the due diligence industry. I think you need to have a more nuanced understanding of everything. And you need to treat every case on its own merits. Like, let's say someone is related to a politician does not necessarily mean that you can't do business with them. They might show up on a politically exposed persons list, and that should lead to a higher level of care. But I think what you were mentioning is sort of a wholesale, cutting them out from their banking relationship. This might be someone who's done nothing wrong their entire life. This might be someone who has been fastidious and following all the rules. And a decent due diligence investigation will say, like, we looked for X, Y, and Z. We didn't find anything to that effect. And especially if you are speaking with human sources to get a better look than even the public record can provide, you might have someone say, this is the most honest person I've ever met. They don't mix any of their business with their family connection. They have no involvement in politics. This is not a front for a politician. This is someone who has their own independent career. And those are all facts that you can learn through an investigation that are the opposite of red flags, where they're green flags. I think I would be very upset if I was sort of removed from a banking relationship because someone said it's due diligence to remove anyone with this flag associated with their name. It's almost like stereotyping, and that's certainly not what I would recommend. I think that if that's a cost-cutting measure, to just jump to that without doing an investigation, I would recommend that those banks cut costs in some other area, and not skip this step, this very crucial step.
Your point is well taken in that there should be no. Yours is a line of work that requires, again, people to view things in nuances and shades of gray. To that end, then it would seem to me that there's no room for ideologues or people who engage in binary thinking, as some of the moralists out there tend to do so. But they're thinking of it in terms of, okay, this saves us a whole world of grief if we do engage in wholesale unbanking or wholesale de-risking. But then the authorities say, no, that again, you're not meeting your burden because from a regulatory compliance perspective, it's about a risk-based approach. And let's be honest, in modern banking, depending on the nationalities involved, depending on the industry, the families, and here I want to stress, and you're quite right, being a politically exposed person does not mean criminal, right? They need banking services too. It doesn't mean criminal. But some people say, okay, being a PEP is such a heightened level of risk, it invites so much scrutiny, I don't want anything to do with it at all. But again, depending on the families, depending on the industry, depending on the professions, depending on the nationalities, you get a certain score. You fit into an institution's risk matrix somewhere. That is the nature of risk-based weightings and compliance. And so that means to suggest then that there is some degree of stereotyping. I remember speaking to someone at HSBC in Mumbai, and he said, yeah, an Indian male coming from Dubai by way of Hong Kong. Yeah, that involves a certain heightened degree of scrutiny because they've had issues in the past. And is it a stereotype or an archetype? I don't know.
I think between heightened scrutiny versus a final decision. Heightened scrutiny might be more justifiable, right? Because you can't do a full investigation of everyone, right? You need to have risk scoring, just like you said, in order for there to be a defensible system. I think regulators have been very clear that they want a risk-based due diligence process. And obviously, right, you need to have some way of determining before you do your investigative work where people might fall. And that's a very important process. It's not my personal specialization, but there are people who are experts at setting up the proper risk scoring system that's going to pass regulatory muster and make sense logically. And then some people are going to get heightened scrutiny, but that's not a final decision to debank them. That it should be, okay, this is our pool of high-risk people. What can we do to determine whether that risk is something real or just something that's by chance, they happen to fall into some categories and they're caught in the mix. Whether or not to debank an entire category of people is a business decision that I'm not qualified to make. I'm just an investigator. I don't usually advise banks on how to make business decisions. But I have seen that the value of investigation is sometimes your first impression is entirely wrong. And that's sort of what I was getting at with biases is the confirmation bias is whatever the first piece of information that you see about someone, that forms an impression in your mind, and all other data that you obtain about that person is colored by that first impression. And I think that confirmation bias is something that we as humans should be fighting against rather than leaning in towards. And I think you do that by getting other information, collecting it, and analyzing it objectively, rather than saying this was my first impression or these things lead in this direction. Therefore, I can just make this decision based on that. But again, there are going to be business decisions that have to do with making money and where you need to spend money. And I can't give too much advice on that. All I can do is advocate for objective investigations at answering questions. And I just, how many times have I seen you start out a case and someone looks very shady? It turns out actually it's all right. And other times someone at first glance, the reason I brought up that example before of someone on the first page of Google, no results, nothing negative, but through the investigation found this was one of the highest risk people I've ever seen in my entire career, right? Someone that I would stay away from 500 yards away at all times kind of person. That wasn't my first impression. Sometimes you just have to do the research or you make a really bad decision.
Well, we can all be duped. I mean, I've certainly been there, and I agree that regulators want you to be able to articulate why you're coming to the conclusions you are, and yeah, I mean that there's no substitute for the drudgery that's sometimes involved. So yeah, your point's well taken. Something that strikes me about your line of work, though, is that I'm seeing more law firms set up their own compliance and investigations practices. I'm wondering, is that an acknowledgement on their part that they're spending too much on investigators and they want to keep more of that work in-house? I mean, and years ago when I was interviewed by Big Four, I won't say which one, but I mean, the nature of what they were putting out in terms of AML, financial crime, FCCA, bribery, fraud, corruption, that type of advice, that type of consulting, it seemed to me dangerously close to the unauthorized practice of law. And increasingly, the more I look at it, there seems to be, it seems to me that the lawyers and the accountants and the consultants and the investigators are competing for some of the same business. Now they would say, no, we're only addressing this part of the chain, of the sequence. Okay, fine. But I mean, the nature of what they're putting out looks dangerously the same. Do you get what I'm saying? I mean, are you to some extent in competition with other professional services firms?
I think it's a big question. And one thing I'd like to, I would say, clarify from my point of view is investigative consultancy is like mine, and I would say like companies you mentioned, are often not doing the same type of investigative work as the attorneys. The attorneys have a few investigative methods that a firm like mine won't be doing, but it's still under the rubric of investigations. I would say investigating witnesses, like if there's a fraud case at a company or a corruption case at a company, investigating witnesses face-to-face is usually done by an attorney, in my experience, rather than an investigative consultancy like me. And what we tend to do is bring intelligence from outside, open sources, public records, and then interviews that are done discreetly, not face-to-face and not so officially. Bringing in that information. So that is sort of the barrier that I tend to see that keeps, the investigative consultant like me in a support role to the attorney and not a competitor to the attorney. And so usually an investigator like me would work at the direction of counsel rather than replacing counsel. In terms of the forensic accountants that work at investigative consultancies versus other types of accountants, you see some overlap there. I could answer the question in more detail. Do you have an example of some scenario you're thinking of, or?
Well, I mean, I flat out said to this guy, this big four firm, look, what you're advising the client to do, I mean, this looks to me dangerously like unauthorized practice of law. And they're like, no, we're not offering a legal opinion. We're suggesting you review the information and you confer with your attorney as to what step to take. And so, I don't know, I mean, it seemed like passing the buck, but let's be honest. I mean, the big four, for example, are engaged. They do investigations, but they've yes, they were known as audit firms, but they've gone beyond that. They call themselves professional services firms. They do a little bit of everything. Because when it comes to certain things, they're competing head to head with the lawyers. Only they're offering package deals for legal services rather than an hourly rate. That's why the lawyers hate them. When it comes to wills and trusts, seems to me the legal profession has largely yielded that part of the battlefield to the accountants. So yeah, I mean, it does seem as though there is some competition. I mean, with certainly with the forensic accountants who do investigations, but yeah, that's just my layman's perspective. Coming back to you, I mean, you worked at some of the top firms in your field. What was it like starting your own firm, and why embark on the entrepreneurial path for yourself? Because you had a pretty comfortable life.
No, absolutely. And they say starting your own business is not for the faint of heart, which is a funny expression in my case, because I'm like, that's me. I'm the faint of heart. It's not easy, right? And so why would you give up a W-2 paycheck, a paycheck every 2 weeks, the same amount, you can count on it, for the uncertainty, the ebb and flow of running your own business and the uncertainty of it? It's just something I've been kind of obsessed with doing for a while, right? I really think that there's a certain type of leadership style that I want to implement, and there's a certain type of focus on high quality investigations that I just can't get out of my head. I can't shake it. And I've said, as soon as I learn enough and make enough contacts and have the capability of going out on my own, I've always wanted to do it. I had the opportunity to do that, after the transaction with my last company. It's a very successful acquisition. And, having that opportunity, it was huge for me. It doesn't mean it was always easy, right? So you said, what is it like to do that? The way I describe it is every good day feels really, really good. You get a new client, you deliver a case that they're happy with, or something of that nature. It feels amazing, right? You feel like you've just conquered the whole world. And the flip side of that is every bad day feels like 10 times as bad as it felt when you were just one person at a big company. Because you think, oh my goodness, my whole livelihood is wrapped up into, my success as a business. Nothing is guaranteed. It's on me. And so any failure, even a small one, can really seem like the end of the world. And so if you're not really ready for that emotional roller coaster, right, as well as a financial roller coaster, some days you think everything's going great, and some days it's like you just you see how many bills you'd have to pay, and it just keeps adding up. If you're not ready for that kind of roller coaster, it might not be the right time for you. And it wasn't the right time for me for a long time. I really did feel more comfortable working under the leadership of others, learning from them and figuring things out. It wasn't until I'd really seen a lot of the management decisions up close and gotten a lot of management experience that I felt like I could handle that roller coaster. And I said, I've seen a lot of ups and downs. I've seen how other people have handled them. So I don't feel like I'm going into this blind. You don't see a lot of new professional services firms, or especially investigative consultancies. You don't see a ton of them starting up. other than one-person shops. It's pretty common for a lot of people to become completely independent and not hire anybody and just be a solo practitioner, which doesn't surprise people who think of like a private detective in an old noir film, right? They're always solo. Something about investigations, it's often a one-person at a time job. So you do see plenty of people with one-person shops, but a lot of the bigger firms are long established. You know, you've got names out there that have been there for 40 or 50 years, and it's not easy to start a new one. I would say knowing what your values are, knowing why you're doing it, and trying to map things out as best as possible while still being open to when things change unexpectedly, you kind of have to shift gears in 5 minutes. If you have that mindset, it can be very, very rewarding, right? Whenever you have those successful days, it really makes it all the worth it. It's also a lot of work to run your own business. That's not a surprise. I would say that in the investigative field, it's also a lot of work to work at a business. So I would say that I'm not necessarily working more hours which is surprising, right? As an entrepreneur, than I was in other previous roles, because I was already working very, very hard. The investigative consultancy field is very competitive, as you mentioned. It's very much a deadline-driven industry, and there's always high expectations, and almost perfectionist expectations, and you don't always have enough time to do it during work hours. You know, lawyers work a lot of hours, and they expect their investigative consultants to often match that. And the same with private equity, whenever they hire investigators and of course banks, financial services. These are all fields that already work a lot of hours. And whether or not you're working for yourself or whether you're working as part of a big company, you're probably going to work some extra hours here and there. I try to set boundaries. I think that's very, very important. I set some boundaries, but I would say that hasn't changed, being an entrepreneur or not. So a little bit of a long-winded answer, but I've been thinking about being in business for myself and being able to control my destiny and do the investigations the way I think they should be done. I've been thinking about that for years.
I mean, kudos, hats off to you for pulling it off. I mean, I think it's been psychologically proven that, broadly speaking, the mindset of a boss and the mindset of an employee are very different. It's not to say there aren't some people that are maybe somewhere in between. But I'd like to stay with you for a second, though. I mean, going from the relative peace and tranquility of being an undergrad at GW in DC, and I mean, for many of my friends, the next step was either Georgetown or, Johns Hopkins SAIS, School of International Studies at that point. You chose to embark on a somewhat different path and go to Tel Aviv for graduate school. Why did you opt for that? I mean, was part of it to get back in touch with your roots?
I mentioned before how international affairs and just thinking globally was a key part, of me growing up, right?
Yeah.
And the Middle East was always probably top of my list for which region I was just most drawn to, most interested in. I do have some family connections to Israel, some friend connections to Israel. And Tel Aviv University they still do this wonderful Middle East history program where it's not just about Israel. It is a modern Middle East history with more of a focus on the Arabic-speaking Middle East, but just by virtue of being in Israel, you have a lot of opportunities to learn about that country as well. I was unsure initially whether I wanted to go to grad school. Some people call it a terminal master's, to get a liberal arts master's degree without getting a PhD. But I really felt that after undergraduate, how old was I? 21 or 22 years old. I did not feel like I had enough skills to make me stand out in the very competitive market in Washington, D.C. for any kind of interesting work, right? I said, a lot of people in this city have political science and international affairs degrees and this and that. They all have internships. They're all pretty accomplished. I felt I needed to do something that was more specialized, more unique, and I wanted to have it stand out. And I wanted it to be true to who I am, yeah. And so I really loved my program at Tel Aviv University. I would say the standards of, getting a good grade I felt were very, very high there. It was very hard to get an A in a class, which I don't want to speak about U.S. universities broadly, but there were plenty of classes where you can get at least a B or maybe an A, just by doing the normal amount. Whereas I think that the Tel Aviv rigor made me push myself in a way that I had never been pushed before academically. And it really set me up for my entire professional career. So I'm very grateful for that.
I think that's the lingering effect of the British educational system. The percentages are just completely out of whack. I mean, I think a 70 in the British system constitutes an A. A 60 constitutes a B. A 50 constitutes a C. I mean, which is fair. I mean, as I see it, if I can remember half of what I learned on the day of the exam, that warrants at least a C. But yeah, I mean, you may think, okay, the percentages are lower, so it's easier to get that grade. Not so. Whereas I thought, generally speaking, from having undergone 9 years of higher education in the U.S., college, law school, 2 master's degrees, I'd say I find the grading in the U.S., generally speaking, to be somewhat more generous. And plus, with extra credit assignments and class participation, there are lots of ways to bring your grade up. But still sticking with Israel, I mean, and this is something you might be qualified to speak on, given you're in the intelligence, with Israel's overall national security apparatus, with all the intelligence modes of gathering intelligence and technology that Israel has and had at its disposal. How is it the events of October 7th were able to happen?
I'll read my provisional answer because there's still an investigation ongoing in Israel today on this question. But I understand that this is still very much an open question, but we do know a few things. First is, it shouldn't surprise anyone that there was intelligence about this attack that was known by at least some people working in military intelligence, or, they had picked up signals, at least. They picked up indications. It's not like this went completely undetected ahead of time. And from what I've read, there was at some level in the chain of command, the dismissive. They say the intelligence was gathered, it was collected, and it was analyzed, but then it was dismissed and said, well, this is very nice, but it could mean a lot of things, right? And so even if you do a good job on the intelligence collection and you analyze it into something actionable, that doesn't mean that action follows. So, why wasn't the intelligence that was gathered taken seriously? Well, the world is a very complicated place, and there's often intelligence that points in the opposite direction too. The prevailing thinking, I think not just in Israel, but among many people in the region, was that Hamas was not interested in this sort of attack, but they were certainly keeping up the armed struggle in their mind, but that they were also they were a government at that point, right? They were focused on governing the Gaza Strip with all the spoils of governance. And there was a lot of thinking in Israel that maybe they want some light wars or low-level wars, but they're not going to dare take on sort of an all-out war. And that thinking was, I would say, related to the idea that Israel was invulnerable to such an attack. There was a high degree of confidence, I think, in Israel that such an attack, such an invasion of the homeland could not take place because of past wars and things like that, the disparity in military power. And so with these ideas in the mind, I believe that they dismissed some of the intelligence. Anything that I say here is subject to revision, more information might come out. And I could opine on other sort of deeper root causes of why Israel missed these signals. But it's obvious that they missed them. They were found. And the attack came about 50 years after the Yom Kippur War, which was almost the exact same situation in terms of an intelligence failure, right? There was, in 1973, intelligence about an impending attack that was similarly dismissed. And the fact that it happened basically 50 years later, it's sort of an incredible historical coincidence, but maybe not a coincidence. I mean, I would imagine that Hamas timed the attack, possibly because of the 50-year anniversary of the 1973 war, which was seen as a success for Egypt and some of the other Arab countries, even though all these points are debated. So I would say, what root cause? Overconfidence, hubris. But from an intelligence perspective, the analysis phase of an intelligence, once you've gathered everything and you've compiled it and you've delivered it to the decision maker, your job isn't done. You've got to find a way to get them to understand that intelligence. And then it's on them to understand, of course, and not be blinded by it. There are other factors as well. I would say the West Bank and Israel's northern border were getting a lot of attention in the lead up to October 7th, right? And so when your attention is divided, sometimes when you're trying to focus on one issue, it can be very hard to convince yourself to focus on a different one that you think is resolved. And that might be a lesson for a lot of different situations. And of course, there is internal situations in Israel in the months leading up to it with the judicial reform, which I'm sure everyone is aware. There were massive protests in Israel against a plan by the Netanyahu-led government to change core elements of Israel's democracy, particularly the role of the judiciary, the Supreme Court. There are many aspects of that are a little technical, but as an American, we understand that the U.S. Supreme Court can sort of strike down a law as unconstitutional, and there is a similar situation in Israel where the Supreme Court can strike down certain government actions or laws, and the Netanyahu-led government was going to change that. And to many people, that felt like one faction of the Israeli system was becoming not checked and balanced, as we say, that unchecked, if this was going to go through. And so this was a very contentious political issue in Israel in 2023. And it might have, I say might because I don't want to jump the gun, but it might have occupied some of the political attention that should have been focused on, if the country was unified and focused on external threats, maybe they would have paid more attention to these intelligence signals when they were noticed. And again, I feel I reserve the right to retract that statement if I'm provided with better information otherwise, because this is a very big question.
So looking ahead to those that are going to come after you, and then clearly, your line of work attracts all types. What advice would you have for those seeking to enter the field of corporate investigations and business intelligence more broadly? What should they study? What path should they embark upon? What skills and knowledge should they attain before they think of entering the profession? Any tips?
To focus on developing your skills and becoming a premier level thinker around these things, and to avoid, the flip side of that is to avoid being so focused on the job that's in front of you, the current, you might get hired as a sort of a lower level junior analyst and focus on more routine cases. And that's fine. You have to do that work very, very well, and you can learn a lot doing that work. But if you get too stuck in a rut and you don't keep the bigger picture of your career in mind, you might not take the extra effort to understand the regulatory, legal, and financial frameworks that underlie a lot of this business. And the more that you understand those bigger picture questions and you understand how these fields work, basically, I mean, these are big fields, right? But law and finance and regulatory matters, the more that you can become a little bit of a subject matter expert on those things, reading the Wall Street Journal or getting newsletters and keeping up with, setting up some news alerts for you for matters of interest. The faster that you will develop, your writing on even your basic cases will be more informed by the broader perspective. You'll get better edits from your editor in the short term, but in the long run, you're going to be able to rise to what I believe is the much better part of the industry, which is the higher end investigative. So there's the high volume work, that they're always hiring, and it's good, important work. In some cases, it's called level one. Some cases, it's called like baseline. And there's a lot of it to go around, a lot of different clients. And so there's a lot of turnover as well, because this is usually you're given a lot of cases to do, a lot of deadlines, and it can be very, very hard. Many people start in this industry and they spend about 1 or 2 years in it, and they decide this isn't for me. That's okay, right? Not every, people need to try out different careers before they settle on one. But if you believe that corporate investigations is for you, you're very interested in it, you're passionate, you love solving problems, you get excited when you talk about research with your friends, these are all signs that you should really consider investing in your career for the long term. And in order to move up the value chain and focus on high-end investigations, you can't simply complete your case and move on to the next and then stop thinking about it. I think you've got to have conversations with people that work in adjacent industries, especially clients. But as much as possible, there's a lot of independent learning that you can do so that you can speak off the cuff about the types of issues you're investigating and not be completely reliant on Googling everything that comes up. And there is, I would say, a ton of opportunity in this space. Still, I am very optimistic about the future of this industry. Every time I hear a trend that people say, is this going to put investigators out of business? The next day I see a lot of job postings. So I think I think you can spend your whole career in this field. But you need to be I would say you need to actively take control of your destiny in this field. It's very hard to find that your normal day-to-day job will automatically push you to where you want to go. Because it is very, very easy to get slightly stuck, and that leads to burnout. If you do the same type of case over and over again, high volume work. Like I said, I'm not disparaging that kind of work. It's very important for many reasons. But as an individual worker, it can be exhausting, it can be draining, and you don't automatically move up just by doing a good job on one tier. You need to show some other kind of learning and development and sophistication. And so maybe that means informational interviews with people who have achieved where you want to go. Maybe that means there's a lot of independent reading, books, and even following the right accounts on LinkedIn. You can learn about new tools and tips and things like that. And so that's my number one piece of advice, is try to get into the high end of the career and do so through active career development and not a sort of passive, just like, oh, I'll get there eventually, I'll move up the ladder. That's, in my experience, that's not always what happens.
Certainly an element of proactivity and then gumption and drive is necessary. And if you're not getting it with that particular firm, then maybe, you do need to jump ship. Though I've seen the other extreme as well, though, Dan, and that, and again, I don't mean to pick on Kroll, but they have amongst the highest industry turnover rates. And certainly in this town, that it was said that affected their corporate identity, their corporate culture, and people, dismiss corporate culture as being important. But it certainly in this line of work, it is important because you needed enough of the older generation to stick around long enough to pass on those values, those skills, that that degree of healthy cynicism, what to look out for, the Coppers A, B, and C's. This is what you need to keep in mind when you do an investigation. You needed enough of those people from the older guard to pass on those skills to the next generation. Yet, what do you see? You see in places like Hong Kong, Singapore, mainland China, certainly southern part of mainland China, job hopping every 3 to 6 to 9 months. It's an achievement if you get someone to stick around for a year. And as we know, I mean, so this wouldn't fly in the U.S., certainly wouldn't fly in the West. You wouldn't get hired with that kind of a CV. But, I mean, having covered HR issues early in my career, it seems to be that the magic number across multiple industries seems to be really, it's only at that 18-month mark where you're at break even for the employer in terms of adding a value and relative to all the time and resources and effort it took to train you. So yeah, I do think if your career isn't progressing at the year 2 or year 3 mark, maybe you need to jump ship. But by the same token, you need to give it the old college try. You need to give it a fair shot.
You jump ship to a new company,
gain.
right? It could be
Yeah.
trying to take on different assignments within your organization or finding a mentor.
There you go. Yeah.
Absolutely.
In the time we've got left, is there anything you feel we didn't cover? Any final impressions you'd like to leave our audience with?
And one of the arguments that I make or goals that I have is that investigations as a practice is not a fully mature industry yet. It's getting better every year. But what we see holding the industry back in some ways is a lack of cross-discipline focus. And that by that, I mean that there are a lot of people that conduct different types of investigations, and they don't always talk to each other. And some examples would be traditional private detectives, your public records due diligence consultancies, and investigative journalists, as well as the cybersecurity community, which is developing open source intelligence techniques using sort of advanced tools that are a little more technical. And then you have attorneys that do these internal investigations, interviewing witnesses and going over spreadsheets with forensic accountants and doing the computer forensics. And if these disciplines were better able to communicate with each other and talk through methodological issues and coordinate, I think that you would see the industry as a whole advance and be better able to serve the very important needs of banks, compliance teams, attorneys, and investors. And we're getting there, but it's been a slow process. And I would just encourage everyone to speak with their investigators, if they have any, and learn about how they are trying to bridge some of these gaps and incorporate the very valuable techniques that different disciplines have into their process. Because I don't think anyone's figured out the exact magic formula yet for the perfect investigation. There's so much that it needs to be hashed out and figured out, and it might never happen. But I think there's a lot of opportunity in this industry. I don't think that the technology is a threat to it at all. I think it's actually just going to amplify and increase the effectiveness of investigations. And yeah, that's my thesis. And I'll just end with thank you, AJ, for the wonderful discussion.
Dan Greenberg, thank you so much for your time. And to our listeners, thank you. Until next time.